When conflict shows up at work, we usually treat it like a character arc. We look for the person who started it. We blame their tone. We blame their attitude. We blame their personality. But if we stay consistent with what we've built so far, conflict is often not a people problem. It's a system problem. I'm Professor Bailey, and today we're asking, why is conflict often a system problem and not a people problem? Conflict is often built on interdependence, scarcity, and differentiated goals. In most workplaces, people aren't truly independent. Even when tasks look separate, they're often connected through timing, information, shared resources, shared clients, shared metrics, approvals. And interdependence requires coordination. Coordination requires alignment, and when alignment is hard, groups are optimizing for different outcomes. This is where classic organizational theory helps. March and Simon, for instance, in their 1958 book, argue that organizational decision-making is shaped by limited information and limited attention. People don't see the whole system, they see their part of it, and they're making decisions under time pressure with incomplete data and often with conflicting signals. So one group is optimizing for speed, another group is optimizing for accuracy, another is optimizing for cost, another is optimizing for risk reduction, another is optimizing for customer satisfaction. And the system often acts like all those goals are equally important at the same time. That's not a personality problem. That's a design that's generating conflict. Conflict often feels sudden because we notice it late, not because it starts late. One foundational model comes from Louis Pondy in 1967. Pondy describes conflict as a process, including latent conflict, perceived conflict, felt conflict, manifest conflict, and aftermath. The latent conflict are those latent conditions that exist. It's scarcity, ambiguity, misaligned incentives. And then we have perceived conflict, where people start to notice there's an incompatibility happening here. When we have felt conflict, our emotion enters the picture. Then we have manifest conflict. That's when the conflict comes to head, usually an expression of behavior like a conversation or us changing the way we act due to frustration. And finally, we have the aftermath of the conflict, where we're repairing, escalating, or avoiding. The reason this matters is that conflict often has a really long runway that's often invisible. Structural tensions build, the misalignments accumulate, and our small breakdowns don't get resolved. And then one moment becomes an incident, even though it was never really just about that one moment. So when organizations treat conflict as an interpersonal disruption, they miss the buildup and they keep the system conditions that generated the friction in the first place. Different kinds of conflict have different roots, so the fix depends on what kind of conflict you're looking at. This is where I want to foreground a key study using a multi-method design, both survey and qualitative approaches inside organizational groups. It showed that the effects of conflict depend on the type of conflict and the context. The study distinguished between task conflict and relationship conflict, and then later work added process conflict. Task conflict is disagreement about the work, priorities, ideas, strategy, and relationship conflict is interpersonal tension, resentment, hostility, dislike. Process conflict is disagreement about how the work should get done, roles, responsibilities, and workflow. Not all conflict is equally harmful. Actually, task conflict can be really useful sometimes under the right conditions. Relational conflict is much more consistently damaging, and process conflict often signals unclear roles, unclear hierarchy, unclear coordination. So if you're trying to reduce conflict, the question isn't usually how do we get people to be nicer to each other. A better question is what kind of conflict is this and what system conditions are producing it. Now, textbooks often pivot here into negotiation tips, and I'll touch on negotiation lightly, but I want to keep this through line. Negotiation often feels like a losing battle when the system is structured against us. A classic foundation here is Walton and McCursey. They distinguish between distributive bargaining, which is splitting a fixed pie, from integrative bargaining, which is expanding the pie through problem solving. In organizations, negotiation becomes exhausting when you're not negotiating about preferences, you're negotiating through constraints and about constraints like headcounts, timing, budget, competing metrics, competing priorities. So if negotiation keeps stalling, a useful question is, are we asking people to solve a distributive problem with integrative language? To summarize, conflict is often the visible symptom of invisible coordination strain. It can be produced by interdependence, scarcity, and incompatible goals. It unfolds as a process. It varies by type and context, and negotiation outcomes often reflect system conditions. That sets us up for our next video. Over time, repeated coordination patterns don't just create conflict, they also harden into culture.